You're listening to Wild Things and Wild Places, a Muley Fanatic Foundation podcast that aims to discuss issues and efforts related to the Muley Fanatic Foundation mission, the conservation of mule deer, furthering the sport of hunting, and sound wildlife management.
Everybody knows I'm a Muley fanatic.
It's time for Wild Things and Wild Places. And here's your guide, Joshua Corsi.
Welcome to another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. Got a great guest in line today and a great conversation that I think you'll find to be fascinating and thought-provoking and something certainly I would hope you would want to share. Joining me today from the Wyoming Migration Initiative, writer and filmmaker, Greg Nickerson. Welcome, Greg.
Hey, Josh. Thank you for having me on the show, and I'm excited to talk about mule deer today.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about mule deer and specific to the work that you do that certainly engages and gathers a lot of conversation, a lot of interest, and I believe what is probably very thought-provoking in many circles, whether it's individually or groups or organizations or even agencies. Wyoming Migration Initiative, certainly a leader in being able to track and showcase these incredible migrations that occur. Let's talk a little bit about your role with Wyoming Migration Initiative and how that fits into the bigger piece of the puzzle.
Josh, I've been working with the Wyoming Migration Initiative since 2016. It started a couple years before that in 2012. It's an effort at the University of Wyoming to track these migrations, map the information, and share that information with the public to further sound wildlife management. We have a lot of alignment with what the Muley Fanatic Foundation is trying to do, and we try and reach the public with social media and films and Facebook posts where we track mule deer that are migrating. And we've also done exhibits and partnered with different agencies to do the research, but also to share that story afterwards.
Yeah, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I think you've helped in many ways be able to provide that visual that is needed for folks to really understand and truly get a grasp of some of the challenges associated with these long migrations that occur with these animals, the fidelity that they hold to these migration corridors. I think it probably started, you need a poster child, if you will, and I think you found that one deer initially, sounds like about when you started with WMI. Deer 255, certainly well documented, a long migration route that was followed year after year and really became a public, gosh, how would you describe it, Greg? The following of Deer 255 was intimate. And
Yeah. And when I say we, I'm really talking about the graduate students we're working with Dr. Matt Kaufman. They are the ones who have been collaring hundreds of deer in the Red Desert area right outside of Rock Springs, mostly near Superior. And out of those hundreds of deer that have been tracked, there's just been, until 2022, there was only one that had ever gone all the way to Jackson Hole and over the Tetons and into Idaho, and that was Deer 255. And when she first did that in 2016, we thought it was a fluke. And we were waiting to see if she would come all the way back to the Red Desert in her fall migration, and then her collar died, and she vanished for about a year and a half. And so all through 2017, we had no idea if she was still living. 2018 March, she was rediscovered down in the Red Desert by chance by a helicopter pilot on our collaring efforts. And then she migrated all the way back to the Tetons in Island Park, Idaho that year. So we knew we had a really interesting deer and that she was going to be just have a story that was going to really be interesting to the public. And during that time, we'd also been tracking a bunch of other deer with nicknames that people might remember. There was Joe and Mo, and Jet was actually the first one that we shared the stories on Facebook and Twitter. And there's also been Dell and quite a series of them. And most of them passed away. 255, she outlived them all and traveled over 3,000 miles in her migrations, and just showed us a lot about the challenges these deer face and the incredible survival strategies they use to make it, and also how fit they are when they make these successful migrations. So that applies to a lot of deer that don't migrate as far as she did too. That's been one of my favorite stories to tell as part of the Wyoming Migration Initiative.
Yeah, and a story worth telling. I think that when you get into the weeds on these long migrations and being able to track that, and you really start to put the pieces of the puzzle of some of the obstacles or challenges that these deer face in their movements, when you look at roadways, you look at fences, you look at subdivisions, rivers, there is a host or a suite of challenges that these deer must navigate on an annual basis twice in their transition from winter range to summer range and then back. I think that's the valuable information, that where it really has a very dialed in application for conservation efforts. When you look at some of these, when you look at wildlife crossings, when you look at wildlife friendly fencing, of course, obviously, I think it's been well documented, and it is historical in my mind, just the acquisition of that bottleneck at Fremont Lake and how that came to be, the timing of that, to be able to protect that landscape, to be able to allow that this migration can persist in perpetuity, because it was such a valuable component to be able to have that landscape be free from development so that these deer could be able to continue to move through that landscape. I think it's an amazing time that we live in, that these stories could be told, where people can gravitate to being able to key in on these components that actually can be provoked for change to allow these corridors to continue to persist for years to come. And they are fragile. They are very fragile. Would you agree?
It's been really heartening to be doing this work at this time when all the technology and the photography and the social media and the mapping, and then all the many partners and groups and agencies are all focusing on migration and trying to keep these habitats between the summer and winter range functional. And we've seen that when we tell these stories and have the science in hand, that it can really empower millions of dollars for conservation. And that's so awesome. That Fremont Lake bottleneck is just an incredible story, where that migration from the right along the edge of Pinedale had been documented about 3 to 4 years prior to that. And obviously people knew that animals migrated through there, but with that GPS data, they could see the importance of that, recognize that property was for sale on the ground, and understand the difficulties that would happen for those deer if they were housing right in the middle of that quarter-mile wide bottleneck. And so with all that information in hand and the photographs of Joe Reese and the maps and all of that, Conservation Fund was able to raise more than $2 million for that, and then buy that property, restore it by moving some fences, and then donate it to the Game and Fish for the Luke Lynch Wildlife Habitat Management Area. So that's just a really inspiring story. We love telling that. And then since then, it's been amazing to see the money that has been unleashed for migrations, whether it's the hundreds of miles of fences that have been retrofitted in Sublette County, greater Green River Basin area, or the tens of millions of dollars for these wildlife crossings along the Wyoming range, and now the Uintas, and also the ones over on I-25 near Buffalo. So that's all just awesome to see. And we play a very small role in all those on the ground efforts, but by sharing these stories, we hope that they're all empowered and accelerated. And Muley Fanatic Foundation is no small part of that. And we really appreciate what you do. And congratulations, by the way, on being the 2023 Partner of the Year with Wyoming Game and Fish. You guys really do the hard work and show up for the mule deer. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Greg. But I would be remiss if I didn't say there are so many folks, so many organizations, even our own state agency. There are so many folks that are champion and becoming great ambassadors for mule deer. Mule deer certainly need all the help they can get. And I think everybody is playing their part to be able to help tell the story, and you guys are doing a fascinating job with that. I think it's a way to be able to provide the information that you tell, that the folks that, from the general public that aren't doing this on a daily basis, working for mule deer in conservation efforts and identifying some of these challenges, it helps them to be able to understand just the overall story and how important that is. And I think anybody that's been following the stories that you've been able to tell, I think that's where they appreciate it. I hear it. I have a good friend of mine that lives in Lander that says, hey, man, I am a Twitter guy, or X, whatever it's being best referred to today. He's, man,
Yep.
I just love seeing the posts that are being made. Of course, we're talking about deer 665 right now. That deer has had already a pretty good following this year. Those continued maps that you've been able to showcase from when it departed its winter range on May 11th to when it arrived on summer range June 14th. You've built a following there. How interesting is that for you to be able to see as a writer and filmmaker, just following that this is created? It's pretty fascinating in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I think people have a hard time understanding whole herds and the wildlife population biology that managers and conservation groups and agencies are all thinking about all the time. But when you can just pull out one deer, tell that one individual story, then it becomes a character that people can really hook onto. And so we have really leaned into that strategy and seeing that people want to understand that information. And when we're familiar with the map of Wyoming or the route we might take on the highway from Rock Springs to Jackson, and then you suddenly have this story of a deer that did basically the same thing paralleling that route. It just really ties that landscape together. And yeah, people are fascinated by it. And we've used different formats. These maps are really pretty simple visually, where they just have dates and they show how far the deer migrated every year. They show the stopovers and how important those are. And then we try and pair that with what happens on the ground in these different places and some of the human stories, whether it's the Oregon Trail or the ranching, that some of these ranches are 100 years old and the deer are able to move through these areas because of maintaining those open spaces. And there's just so many stories to connect with what these animals are doing. And we've also done some animations that show where these mule deer move, and that has been a really successful format. Can combine that with some of the on-the-ground imagery from Joe Reese and from our own field technicians, Tanner Warder. And when you put all that together in an animation with some storytelling about the conservation, it's been really successful. And we've seen some of these animations have over 1 million views on the social media channels. And when you put all those together, it's over 4 million views that have happened on those animations, not to mention these migration maps. There's a ton of people who are interested in this, understand the mule deer and all the other species that need these migrations to persist.
I do think the animations are absolutely essential to be able to create that initial buy-in for folks to want to understand, to want to follow and continue to be engaged and follow. Migrations like these that have been showcased, they are very unique to Wyoming. They are certainly an important part of our cultural, hunting, and conservation heritage, I believe. I think that intimate understanding that comes with being able to see and look at this from afar, to understand this individual critter and its persistence to be able to survive this landscape. And this landscape is significantly different from where those low elevation winter ranges are to their high elevation summer ranges. And then, as you just mentioned a minute ago, and I think this is what's been so critical for me, when you look at deer 665, those 200 miles over 35 days, but 11 of those days that were spent within those stopover areas, it is those landscapes and the nutrition that is being gained in those stopover areas that become so critical. And I think sometimes when we look at these migration corridors in their entirety and these lines on the map, it's being able to key in on some of their moments of pause or their stopover areas to realize how important that is on the landscape as they are gaining the necessary fat reserves that they need to be able to ultimately, in the bigger picture, be able to survive the harsh winters that Wyoming sometimes can throw at them. And we've seen a few of those in the last decade.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think a lot of your listeners are going to be familiar with the idea of the green wave of vegetation, and the spring migration is what allows those animals to locate the best, most nutritious food they're going to find all year. And so they're moving from the desert basins up towards the mountains, and as they're following that line of melting snow, that's where the plants are sprouting, and those are the easiest to digest, and that's where they get a ton of their fat gain to recover from winter, prepare for raising their fawns, and grow those antlers that a lot of hunters are after. And then they need to be able to have a great summer range where they can put on a lot of fat, lactate, and get the energy to make it through the winter. Because when those snows fall in the Tetons, that's the epic skiing area, right? It's
Right.
not a great place for mule deer except for these tiny little pockets. So this herd has evolved this strategy to go from one of the wettest parts of the greater Yellowstone with the most snow to one of the driest. And this superior winter range where this particular herd is has had greater survival than some of the other snowier winter ranges that are closer to the Wyoming range. There was something like 70% survival in that horrible winter we had in 2023 last year, where it was flipped, where it was like 70% mortality in some of these other herds where it's snowier. The Green River Basin just has this amazing gradient where there can be a couple feet of standing snow in Pinedale and Big Piney and dry as a bone down in Rock Springs. The deer know it. The elk used to migrate that whole distance. The pronghorn know it. And you must know it too, because you live down that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, I'm curious when you've been able to assess and look at the amount of information that's been compiled. It seems to be when you look at some of these migration corridors and you look at these maps or these visuals that have been produced, there is an obvious bottleneck or stoppage at the I-80 corridor. And I know you've done some work on that. How do you see that fitting into the potential for someday, hopefully, being able to secure the necessary funds? Certainly, I would think our federal partners would have to be a key stakeholder for these type of efforts. But at one point, it's not hard to imagine that these deer migrated further south than what they do now because of the blockage that I-80 proposes now as just an obstacle that is impassable for many.
Yeah, the interstate's 400 some miles long across southern Wyoming, and it's going through some of the best winter range anywhere in the Rocky Mountains, and that's why there's such huge numbers of pronghorn in southern Wyoming, and mule deer are also migrating down that far. And when the winters get really bad, you higher concentrations of these animals along that interstate because they're moving as far into the desert as they can. And it's no mistake that the railroad and the interstate go through there because if you have to cross the Rockies, it's a lot easier to do it in the desert than it is up on I-70 between Denver and Salt Lake. The analyses of all these millions of GPS points has shown that there's just very rare crossing of Interstate 80. And that's particularly bad for the pronghorn that need to run away from snow and find those little patches of winter habitat that are the most energy efficient. But it's also affecting these mule deer. And a lot of folks with Wyoming Game and Fish, Hall Sawyer with Western Ecosystem Services, a lot of people speculate that these mule deer on this corridor would have migrated even further south of the interstate and into Brown's Hole when that landscape was open. And the deal is that these animals can jump a lot of fences and they could jump right over the interstate fence as it currently stands, but the traffic is so high, it's up to 10,000 vehicles a day in some cases. And so that traffic has created pretty much a complete barrier. And there are anecdotes of individual animals or small herds crossing at underpasses or road crossings underneath, but it's not functional habitat for most of these animals. So we really cut their winter range in half and eliminate a lot of their options. And then there's a lot of fencing adjacent to it that really messes up the pronghorn. But I know we're going to talk about mule deer, so that gives you a little picture. And we have the ability to do some of those analyses and model and project forward where they might go. And I can't say that if you put a overpass in south of the Superior that a ton of animals would move, but it might give them some more options. As it is, the Lucite Hills are a pretty excellent winter range a lot of years, a lot of shelter, a lot of brush that they can live in. And we're just preventing them from exploring any other habitats on their winter range. So well, hopefully someday some more solutions will happen and we'll see that happen. We'll see some more overpasses near Superior as we have over by the Sisters and Fort Bridger and the ones that are in progress over by Elk Mountain.
Yeah, it seems to me like if there is an absolute I don't know if it's the right way to express this, but if there is a future goal in mind that this work can provide, I would like to think that it's certainly helping push this initiative to recognize how important the connectivity of migration corridors are, and that ultimately it could be one of the byproducts of this work is to see some of these overpasses put in these strategic locations that have been well documented and mapped, and provide through sound science the opportunity for these landscapes and their connectivity to be maintained. As a film maker and as a writer, I would imagine that being able to look at these stories, look at potential for future outcomes with increased connectivity, it's got to be an exciting opportunity for you individually to be a part of this effort.
A huge part of my reason for doing this is just because I grew up as a hunter and mostly chasing elk over by Matitsi, big, amazing migration over there. And I just have it in my heart and my life goal that if I can make a small difference for these animals by telling these stories, I want to do that. And also, it's really fascinating. I never get bored learning about what these animals are doing and how the geography all fits together. And it's just an amazing part of the world we live in. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to play a role in it.
Yeah, we're appreciative of the efforts that you put forth. I know the films that were showcased at Mule Deer Days, certainly the folks that were able to take those in, the promotion of those through email and social media platforms have certainly built an audience, I think, that really is gravitated towards this. I don't know how you track what kind of subscribers or followers that you have been able to garner with these efforts, but I would think that it's a growing audience on a regular basis.
It's been really fascinating to watch that and track some of that social media. We know that there's tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people who are following this migration tracking. The films themselves, whether it's us showing it in person at places like Mule Deer Days or just putting them online, they're reaching a lot of people. And we just recently finished a film called Animal Trails about the migrations in and around Jackson Hole and all the collaborative effort to map those migrations and conserve them. And it's been fun to see the response of that. And a lot of other folks are making films too. The Monteith Shop has made some films about mule deer, and we work with them a lot on tracking the nutrition of these herds and seeing the benefit of migration. And yeah, this is a language of telling these migration stories that we hope other folks pick up and start telling those stories themselves, because if we can all be on the same page about how these animals move and why the migrations matter, then it's going to make for a lot more coordinated efforts, whether it's highway crossings or whatever else.
Yeah, said Greg. What's on the horizon for you and for the Wyoming Migration Initiative? What are some future works that are in the think tank right now that folks can look forward to being able to follow and be a part of?
Yeah, we're going to keep telling the story of animals like deer 665 and the red desert to Hoback. There's dozens of other migrations that have been mapped, but we've been telling that particular story and people are really familiar with it. And I think it continues to make an impact. So we'll keep focusing on that herd. We also, there's a lot of things going. We've got some film work going on. My colleague Patrick Rogers has got an upcoming film about pronghorn that's in the development stages, and that's an exciting story. And I can't give you all the details about that, unfortunately. We're also in talks to make a film about the reestablishment of bison migration in Yellowstone, drawing off the master's thesis of a colleague of mine named Janie Fugate. We have kind of adjacent to the Migration Initiative, there's something called the USGS Corridor Mapping Team. And so that's working with all the Western states to map migrations of pronghorn deer and elk. Basically, when those states collect that GPS data, we have a team that can process it, make the maps pretty, and then we publish those reports online through the USGS so that folks like yourself or agencies can use those migration maps in in their work. So that is all proceeding. We're in the fourth volume of that. That's been a hugely exciting effort to see that this Wyoming, I'm going to call it the Wyoming Migration Conservation Model, but it might be a little bit of a stretch because lots of other states have done a lot too. But
yeah, I know you're humble. I know you're not going to say it. I know Dr. Kaufman isn't going to be someone that would toot his own horn as well. But I know things like our secretarial order that we seen several years ago, our own executive order that Governor Gordon implemented here in Wyoming. I know all of those have come to fruition because of work like this that has been taken on by the Wyoming Migration Initiative, a key stakeholder for these type of conversations, these key and monumental decisions and landmarks within really what has become the attention that is needed for these type of acts and orders to be able to be put in place that will look to protect and enhance these corridors. And so just a big thanks, a big gratitude for all the work. And I know there are many people that have been involved with this, but certainly it is very appreciated. And I say that with the most genuine gratitude that I can offer. So thank you for that.
That's very humbling, Josh. And as you mentioned, there's dozens of people who played a role in this. There's more than a dozen funders of just this one Red Desert to Hoback study who we're grateful for. Been with us all along the way. And what we're seeing here is something that's really possible in America because we've got this democratic system. We've got a really robust nonprofit sector. We've got good science that can tease out what the actual biology is. And because we can see all these people working together, we're really able to achieve something special here for keeping these animals alive and also meeting our own needs economically as a state. So I'm really excited to play a small role in that. And I'm just grateful to see this American conservation system at work. And Wyoming's a special place to watch this happening right now. And hopefully its momentum will just keep building.
Yeah, on that note, Greg, I'm curious, in working with other Western states, what kind of role do you see Wyoming in as a whole? Do you feel, particularly with big game ungulates and the mapping of migration corridors, do you feel like Wyoming is in the driver's seat or leading the way, or where is the role that Wyoming is placed on that?
It's an interesting thing. We were not the first state to map migrations. We were not the first state to put in wildlife overpasses. Utah and Montana had some of those decades before Wyoming did. What I think we have seen here is that there's been some of the important science that's helped break through the understanding of migrations has actually happened here, whether it's identifying that it's not just geese in Europe that make these stopovers on green grass, it's also these large ungulates, and we've been able to use that data to tease out that importance. And that was really a landmark thing that happened. And we've seen a lot of really fascinating thing that's pushing that field of academic migration science forward here. We've also seen in this Red Desert to Hoback herd how there's differences there's different strategies across this herd. There's short migrations, medium migrations that go up to the winds and long distance, and then the ultra long distance like deer 665. And when you compare all those different strategies, the longer migrating ones are reaching apparently better habitat, and even though they travel further, they're gaining more fat in the summer and maintaining more fat in the winter. So anyway, it's fascinating stuff to learn. And I think Wyoming has played a role in advancing some of those questions. And other states, we hear from members of the public from other states, boy, I wish we were telling these types of stories in Idaho or Utah. There's even state and federal collaboration that happens, which, state and fed have history of not getting along great all the time, but migrations and these maps are part of what can help people work together. We need that. We need that information. We need this storytelling.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it any better. I've said it 100 times. The flavor of the day in the conservation community of the 21st century is collaboration. And I think it's going to take all of us to continue to move the needle forward when it comes to the conservation for mule deer. And there's a lot of moving parts there, but it's efforts like this that I think are absolutely valuable for us to be able to continue to have the conversation, showcase the challenges and the obstacles that will ultimately lead us to the solutions that are needed for conservation for mule deer. Greg, I appreciate your time on this. I appreciate everything you do. We're very grateful for the partnership and to be able to support your efforts and the team at WMI. Anything we didn't cover that you wanted to get out there?
Yeah, we just really appreciate everyone who's supported our work, and also all the work to put this data into work on the ground. In particular, everything we've done has been possible through partnering with Game and Fish and the land management agencies, the BLM and Forest Service and National Park Service, and also the private landowners that we worked with along the way. So we just thank everyone for stewarding these migrations. Our group did not invent the idea of taking care of migrations or the science or the storytelling or any of that. And we're just excited to see the groundswell of interest in this from Green River Basin and Bighorn Basin and Lander area and everywhere else. Thanks for everybody for helping to take care of our great state.
Yeah, Greg, lastly, where is the best place for folks to be able to follow the work of the Wyoming Migration Initiative? Is there one portal or one platform that you would recommend, or is it just multiple with all the different social media venues that are available?
Yeah, so we do have a website where you can find all of these social media, but if you just search for Wyoming Migration Initiative on any of the social media channels, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, also Vimeo, you'll see our stuff come up. Our films are mostly on Vimeo and YouTube. That's the easiest place to watch them. The migration tracking happens every spring and fall on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So those are great places to follow it. And there's also, if you want to tap deeper into the migration information, you can look at something called westernmigrations.net, and you can see data for all the herds that have been mapped and the data released across Wyoming and the rest of the West. So those are some great places to start, and makes a huge difference when people share those efforts across social media and tell their friends about it, because really these stories have to live in the public if we're going to keep making progress. So we sure appreciate all the groups like yourselves that have shared those posts and helped grow that audience for migrations.
Yeah, glad to do it, Greg. Absolutely. Hey, Greg, thank you very much for your efforts. And again, thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure to visit with you. I sure do appreciate and look forward to having you as a guest in the future, because you are part of the game-changing, trailblazing community that is bringing new information to the fold. And so I know that the opportunity for us to visit in the future is certainly going to be there, and I look forward to that day.
I look forward to it too, and hopefully we'll see it Mule Deer Days next year and other places. And yeah, I just really appreciate the platform to tell some of these stories. And if you did want to talk a little bit more about Deer 665, we could add that in. But
yeah,
I know we've been at it for a little bit.
we certainly have talked about a lot of things, but Deer 665 is certainly a special deer and a special story. You know? Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. I'll tell you a little bit about this migration, because the final leg of this migration was fascinating this year, 2024. She started her migration late, May 11th. A lot of the other animals are leaving March and April. Crosses Highway 28, goes past the Prospect Mountains, ends up near Boulder, Wyoming in the first week, does a stop over there for 4 days near some of those Finger Lakes near Pinedale. By the next week, she's right at Hoback Rim, does a 5-day stop over in Bondurant area, crosses that 4-lane highway at nighttime into South Park, where there's a small amount of open land there, goes across a golf course, swims the Snake River, and then she ends up close to Teton Pass. And she was at the exact spot where that big landslide happened that closed down the Teton Pass highway on June 7th and 8th. And she kept going. And then she doubled back to Teton Pass and apparently stopped her migration on June 14th and probably had her twin fawns up there. So it's really crazy to see how this deer went through a very developed, busy area to finish her migration. And then she ended up in the spot where the landslide happened. And the timing of that's crazy, right? Because it's an amazing thing to think about. Tired of that big event that shut down that highway to Jackson for 3 weeks this year. So fascinating story. It was really fun to share that on social media.
Yeah, I know we enjoyed seeing the updates on that. And then when you look at it from start to finish as a whole, seeing that 166-mile migration when you start thinking about and looking at some of the specifics to as you mentioned, the roads that were crossed, the fences that were crossed, the rivers that were swam, the subdivisions that were encountered, it really just, you said it, resilient. It shows how incredible these critters are and how faithful they are to these corridors. And when do you anticipate you'll start to see that movement again where she starts to begin her trek back to winter range?
It usually begins with the first major snow that happens in October. And so she'll start moving back mid to late October. And by November, a lot of these deer are passing through Pinedale and heading down to the Prospect Mountains. And we've seen them arrive down in Superior by late November, early December, and as late as January. Yeah, we'll look forward for that fall migration, assuming everything goes well for her this summer. And November is when we'll find out if she was able to bring her twin fawns all the way down on that migration. Last year, she had no fawns in November in the Prospect Mountains. So hopefully this year will go better, and she'll make her small contribution to the mule deer populations bouncing back.
Yeah. No, what a great way to book in the conversation, Greg. I'm glad we touched on some of the particulars because it is fascinating. And those, if you haven't been following Deer 665 or you haven't seen it, please take a look at some of the maps. I think the visual and just that tangible tracking of what has been conveyed through WMI showcases, if you're familiar with that landscape at all and how different that landscape is from its winter range to its summer range, it doesn't take a deer scientist to be able to understand that, wow, resilient for sure. So
yeah, incredible animals and incredible survival strategies that they've got, and what a special part of the world that we get to live in and share with these animals.
Greg, thank you again. It's been a pleasure, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Appreciate the opportunity, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, you too. Greg Nickerson, writer, filmmaker for Wyoming Migration Initiative. Please check them out. All the social media platforms that are out there, if you search this out, you will find them without any issue. Been another great episode on Wild Things and Wild Places. Greg Nickerson.
And that wraps up another episode of Wild Things and Wild Places. But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Make sure you never miss out by subscribing. Whether you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, streaming us on our website, or following us on social media, subscribing is the best way to stay connected. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more wild episodes.
Everybody knows I'm a muley fanatic.